Good day. I have to talk to you today in connection with Iraq. I've been asked to give a small presentation about what it is that I am trying to do for some people who have approached me in Iraq with a problem. The problem is this, that there appears to be a very large increase in cancer in Iraq. And the question is there a large increase in cancer in Iraq? And secondly, in the last 10 years. And secondly, what's caused it? So this is how I proposed to them to deal with it. So that there's a project which enables us, first of all, to see if there is a large increase. Secondly, to try and identify the cause. And thirdly, if the cause has to do with what we think it has to do with, which is the contamination of Iraq with uranium from weapons usage by the United States and the UK in 2003 war, and then later, and before that in 1991, to see whether maybe some compensation can be obtained from somebody for all of the deaths and all of the cancers. Who am I? Well, I'm Christopher Busby, and I'm an expert on the health effects of uranium and particularly uranium weapons, and I've worked in this area since the 90s, since the 1990s, when I gave evidence to the American government on the health effects of depleted uranium weapons, which had been used a lot in 1991. And by 2010, I had been approached by a number of people in Fallujah to ask if it was possible to do a study there to see whether there was any evidence of the effects of uranium in terms of congenital malformations and genetic damage and other things. And I did that with them. There were 2 studies that we carried out and 3 papers that were published in the scientific peer-reviewed literature. And the first one of those was an epidemiological study based on a method which I developed in the 1990s to look at cancer risks around nuclear power stations. And we did a number of those studies also and found high cancer risks, or significant cancer risks, in 3 nuclear power stations in the United Kingdom. And since then I've done quite a lot of work in the same area. And I've discussed the problem of the current radiation risk model endlessly in the literature. So I'm the right man for the job. Well, what is the job? First of all, there is such a thing as the Iraqi Cancer Registry, and those people who obtain data from doctors and from various sources, they plot the risks of various cancers in different parts of Iraq. But they don't really look very much, or they don't look at all, at the causes of the increase in cancer. There's been an increase in cancer which they concede in the latest 2023 report which has been produced. But the question is, where exactly are these increases occurring, down to small areas, and what's the cause of them? And of course they don't ask that question. Now, in Fallujah, what we did, and the general study, what you do, is you go and obtain a population that you consider to be at risk. So you find a population which has been exposed to depleted uranium, in this case, and we're looking here at 2 areas. One is Nasiriyah, and the other is Basra. Because both of those places were attacked by the United States, and an awful lot of uranium was used there. And these uranium bullets and unexploded uranium penetrators were all over the place after the war. And children picked them up, and the dust got into the water supply, and the dust went in the air, and it went everywhere. And so you can say that there are places in Nasiriyah, in Basra, or down further south on the border, Makhada, with the Kuwaiti border, where I went in 2000 at the request of Saddam Hussein to measure uranium on the ground, which I did. We found uranium on the ground, we found it all over the place. And I made a couple of documentary films with Al Jazeera. In those days, Al Jazeera was still independent. I mean, Al Jazeera are not quite so independent anymore, most people say, and I have found out. So those studies were funded by Al Jazeera, or those, not the studies, the visit and the measurements, but also we got some money from various people associated with Al Jazeera to do the studies. Now, what I proposed to these people to do was to do the same study in Nasiriyah, to start with Nasiriyah, to find an area where the people said that there were lots of uranium attacks, where the United States fired lots of uranium bullets, an area which is pretty much accepted to be contaminated. So we find an area like that, and we draw a line around it. So we isolate an area for the epidemiological study. We say between this road and that road and this road and that road, we are going to look at the cancer rates or the cancer incidence in the last 5 years in that area. And we can do that without any sort of regard to the cancer registry or anybody else who we may or may not believe, because we don't have to bother with them. We can go around them and we can go independently to see what's happening. And the beauty of this method is you also get the population. So what you do is you knock on the door. Some people from this organization that I'm advising go there, like they did in Fallujah, and they knock on the door in this area and they say, hello, we are from the so-and-so organization, and we want to know, we want you to fill out this little form, this little questionnaire. And the questionnaire asks, first of all, who is living there, and what their sex and ages are, and how long have they lived there. And then, has anybody there suffered from cancer in the last 5 years? If so, what cancer? And if so, how old were they when it was diagnosed? And are they still alive? Also, did they smoke cigarettes? That kind of thing. And also we asked if there were any children born in this house, in this location, you know, where the door is. The person answers, and they say, yes, 2 children were born and they're okay. Or 2 children were born but one of them died shortly after birth, or 2 children were born and one of them had a gross deformity, congenital malformation. So this way we get all of the illness information. We get the information for the cancers, like there was, in this house there was one woman who had breast cancer and she died at the age of 43. And you write all that down. So at the end of the day you have all the cancers. But for do epidemiology, you also have to have the population from which they were chosen. So how many people were there from which those cancers occurred. So you need to know the whole population in the area. But that again you get by asking the questions. So you say, you know, how many people live here, how many men, how many women, how many boys, how many girls, how old are they? So you have the population. And with those two things you can work out the rate. You can work out the number of breast cancers per 100,000 population of that age group, or even just generally. Then what you do is you compare that with the national, or else with an unexposed population. Of course the national population is not really unexposed, so you would compare them with the population of, say, Jordan or Egypt. And that gives you what's called a relative risk. So you might find that, as we did in Fallujah, you know, that the relative risk is 35 for leukemia in young people, and that's astonishing. That's worse than Hiroshima, and so that would be a big find. The other thing that you do, or what we would like to do, is to find another area where we know that there hasn't been any uranium used. So there must be parts of Iraq that were not attacked by the Americans and where hardly any uranium was fired. And so you do the same thing there, and then that gives you a control group. Then you don't have to bother with the national averages or any other country. You can just look at 2 populations. You can look at a study group, and you can look at an unexposed control group, and you can compare the 2. The reason you have to have the populations is because cancer goes up with age. So the older you are, the more likely you are to get cancer. So you need to know the population you're dealing with, how many old people, how many young people. because obviously if you have a lot of old people in a population, you're going to have a lot more cancer. It doesn't mean that they've got more cancer because of uranium. It just means that they're more old people, you see, so you have to control for that. Anyway, all of this is straightforward. It can all be done, but somebody has to do it. So the people I'm working with say that they will do it, and then they will let me have the information, and then I will do the calculations, and we'll see what we find. And if we find that there's an excess of cancer in an area which has been exposed to uranium fire in a war, compared to another area where there was no uranium in the war, then you have to ask the question: can we get compensation for this? Should we get compensation for this? Is it a moral issue? Is it a question of a war crime? Frankly, it is a war crime to use these weapons. I mean, there's no question about that. These weapons do cause cancer, and they cause them in the population, so they're weapons of indiscriminate effect, and that is a war crime. That's like using a poison gas, and that's banned by the Nuremberg Convention. And we have always argued, and many depleted uranium activists have argued, that depleted uranium should be classified as a weapon of mass destruction, which it is, as we found in Fallujah. So the other thing you can do, I mean, all of this depends on money, of course, because these things cost money. The measurements cost money. That is to say, the measurements of contamination cost money, because you have to send this stuff, have to send samples to laboratories. And of course, the laboratories are independent laboratories. They don't work for nothing, and you have to give them money in order to get samples measured. In fact, the going measurement using inductively coupled mass spectrometry for uranium is about £250 per sample. But anyway, you don't have if you don't have the money to do that, you don't do that. You don't have to do that. You can just say, well, hey, these people said they were all attacked by uranium by the Americans, and these people say they weren't attacked by the Americans. So that's the proposal. I've been asked to float it past you. These people in Iraq that I talk to are concerned, as well they should be, and they want to know the answer. And indeed, so do I. Because at very minimum, if we find this, even if we can't get compensation, I say we, I won't get compensation, but I'm saying these people, the poor victims of this war, might perhaps get compensation, or at least some kind of acceptance that their illnesses have been caused by a war in which they really took no part. They just happened to be living there as onlookers, as innocent citizens who just happened to live there. And then all these bullets were whizzing around. And then the next thing they knew, in 5, 10, 15 years, they were all dying of cancer. And that's horrible. So there we are. I have presented what it is that I will be doing with this organisation. If I can, if we get the data. So there we are. Thank you for listening, and good day.